Hi, Andreas from Toddle here, and welcome to the first video in the series Learn Toddle in 7 days. Today we're going to build our first app, which is going to be a weather application that shows the current weather where the user is browsing the app from. So I'm going to start, I'm on my the toddle.dev website. I'm going to go into Open App. If you've not signed up already, you'll see sign up or login buttons here. So you can go ahead and do that. And either way, you'll end up on this page right here where you can see a list of all your projects. Of course, if you don't have any yet, you won't see a list, but you'll still get these create new buttons. And I want to create a new web app. And I'm going to select the template. The template is going to be the blank template for this. I'm going to call this toddle_weather. You'll notice below the name input field here, we've got this ID. And the ID sort of get automatically filled when you type in the name, but you can also change it independently. And it's essentially what is the URL going to be for your Toddle app, right? So in this case, it's going to be toddle_weather.toddle.site. So you can change this, make sure the ID matches something you would want. You do need to find one that's not already taken because they are all globally unique. So I'm going to go and create this project, and then I get sent directly into my editor. So this is the Toddle editor, and you can see there's different parts to it here. I'll just do a quick tour about each part. For this project, we won't be using Toddle to its full capabilities. So there's a lot of parts where we'll just kind of skip a little bit over them because we'll pick them up in later videos as we need the different parts. So one of the common things you always use is the canvas. And the canvas here sits in the middle of the screen. And you can see this shows the current application you're working on, right? So I can interact with it, select different parts of it. I can resize the canvas both in width and size. And I can also hold down space and then drag around to like reposition it. So this can be you can also, and the last thing of course, is that you can hold down Command or Control and scroll to resize, to sort of zoom in and out. This also works with pinch on like trackpad devices. This can be quite nice if you're trying to design for like a very large screen, but you're not on such a big screen. You can still sort of zoom out and see what is this going to look like. And likewise, if you really want to get in close and be absolutely pixel perfect, you can kind of zoom in and make sure you're really seeing every part. I'm just going to reset that. So the next part here is we've got our bottom bar. And we'll see a few things here. We'll see we've got first a user indicator showing that this is me, Andreas, who's currently editing. Undo and redo button. You can also use Command or Control Z, Command and Control Shift Z to do the same. Then we've got some quick sort of resize options. 3 buttons that basically just changes to common sizes. You can also use the hotkeys 1, 2, and 3 to do that. Along with like your size indicator, and then a little reset zoom button here, like because if you've gotten all the way in, you might want to just go back to your normal position. Then we've got our AI bot that is really useful here. So if you are stuck and need to understand how something works, you can kind of open this up. I'll just move myself over to the side. You can open this up and say, how does components work in Toddle? And the Toddle AI bot is sort of trained on all our documentation, all our YouTube videos, everything. So it has a really vast knowledge about how to use Toddle, and you can always go and ask it a question if you want help with how to do something in Toddle, right? Then we've got our play button. So whenever you're working in Toddle normally, you're working what we call edit mode, right? When you click on H1, you'll select that, and then you can edit different parts of its properties. If we click the play button, which is also T for shortcut, for test, then we go into interactive mode, and there you can actually interact with your application in real time to see how does it work. You can kind of exit that out again. And then finally, we've got our preview here in a new tab, and that basically just opens that version of your app in a new tab, so you can interact with it exactly the way you would when it's published. Which kind of leads us to the last button, which takes us to the page where we can publish this version of our application. In Toddle, you're always working what's called branches. So it's kind of its own version, but it's actually its own sort of, when we say branch, we really mean a whole separate entity. You can have multiple versions within one branch. It makes a ton of editing going back and forth between them. And multiple people on your team can work in their own branches without interfering with each other. And you only need to sort of merge changes in together once you're ready to publish what you're working on. So it works really well. Branches are really powerful for when you're a team of people that needs to work together asynchronously. You might not be in the same office, you might be across the planet, and everybody can kind of work on their own set of features they want to implement without ever accidentally stepping on someone else's toes. Right. So that's sort of the center of the screen. On the left, we have here our element tree. And so if you're familiar with HTML, this probably already makes a ton of sense. If you're not, it may look a little bit weird. So HTML is the sort of fundamental language that web apps or websites are constructed in. So it's kind of like a template for what you want on screen, like your UI. It's all divided into these elements, HTML elements. So whenever you're looking at a website or web app, what you're really seeing is a bunch of different HTML elements that have been styled in different ways. And in this case, in our blank template, we have at the top a div. So a div is like your basic box, essentially. I want to create a box. Your go-to here is a div. It's short for divider. I'm not 100% sure there's anybody still alive that knows why. It's sort of a weird name, but essentially it's just your standard box. I need like something on the screen, a container that can contain essentially other elements, do layout. You can add a background color to anything like that. Div is kind of the go-to tool here. Inside that, as what we call children of that, we have an H1, which is a heading 1, and a paragraph P. And so these tags are HTML tags. It's not just names, like they actually have a semantic meaning to the browser. So, for example, a search engine, when crawling this website, is going to look at that H1 and saying, oh, that's clearly the title of the page. So when people search for things like that, this is very likely something that I should show, right? So it matters a lot, for example, for SEO and search indexing. It also matters for accessibility, like people who are using assistive technologies. These technologies are looking at the HTML to figure out, to try and understand what the application actually does and how it works and where to find the information on screen they're looking for. So that's sort of the explanation as to why some of these tags may look a little bit weird. It's because we're very much following the HTML specifications for all these. That also means that once you learn Toddle, you essentially know HTML and you can communicate easily with other developers building websites in whatever technology they're doing. So there's a ton of HTML elements. We will use some in this tutorial, and we'll use a ton more in the future tutorials. And as we use them, we'll explain what they do and how they work. You can also go read about HTML, learn about HTML if you want to do that separately, read up what are the kind of elements that are available. Some of them are what we call functional, meaning they actually have functionality tied, like built into them. And some of them are just semantic, like in this case, the H1 and the paragraph. So on our right, now we sort of covered that. On our right, we have our sort of inspector panel, or sometimes we just call it the right panel. And based on what you have selected, this will kind of show different things. So since we now have a H1 selected, we're going to see this element, we're going to see the properties for that. So we've got our styling tab first. This is basically all the styling that is set for this element and a lot of the other things that we can set. So we can see we set the font size, we've got a text color down here. And we can set all sorts of properties, and essentially these all map one-to-one to CSS properties that you can set using CSS. You don't need to know CSS to use Toddle, but in the same time, if you learn Toddle, you kind of learn CSS at the same time, because we use exactly the same system that CSS does. And the benefit of that, again, is that what you're learning here, what you're using, is just the web standards, right? Always trying to stick to the web standards because they work really, really well, and they're kind of eternal in the sense that future generation of browsers are going to support the same standards. We're not currently going to change it all up, right? The second panel here, or the second tab, is our attributes tab, and we've got a few things here. We've got a selector where we can change the tag that we're using. So you can see here we've got a lot of different options for HTML tags, and again we'll cover at least some of them in future videos. We've got attributes. Again, this is part of the HTML specification. You can add additional information to an element, and for different types of functional elements, they end up having different properties. We'll cover all that as we dive deeper into these elements in future videos. And we'll cover all of these other properties as well. Finally, on the events tab, we can sort of configure Toddle to react to different user input events. So for example, when a user clicks an element, we can define what should the application do when that happens, etc. And you can see we've got quite a lot of different events that are available here. We basically, anything that the web supports, that the web platform supports, you can also do in Toddle. And finally, I want to show here that when you don't have anything selected, so I had the heading 1 selected, and I can either click outside or just press escape, and I'll deselect everything. And then you'll see this inspector panel or right panel for the current page you're working on. And there's a ton of different options here. You can add variables, APIs, formulas, workflows, and you can react to lifecycle events. And again, we'll cover most of these things in future videos. But for now, what we want to do is actually add a API, because we need to be able to fetch the information for our weather application we're building, essentially showing us the current weather. So an API is short for Application Programming Interface, and it's essentially a way for multiple computer systems to communicate together. So in this case, our weather API actually is running on a completely different computer somewhere. And we want to ask it for information about the current weather at our location. And to do that, we need to sort of send it a request saying, can you give me the information about the weather at where I am right now? And it will then return some data about the weather at your current location. So we are going to start our application by adding that API to Toddle. So I'm going to make sure nothing is selected, and then click the plus button next to APIs here. The first thing I'm going to do is give my API a name. Delete that again. So the first thing I'm going to do here in building our weather app is I'm going to add this API to my page. So making sure nothing is selected in the canvas, I'm going to choose APIs and then click the plus button next to it. And now I'm gonna choose to name my API weather. And I'm going to check that the auto fetch is selected. So auto fetch here means that the Toddle will automatically make that request. So in order to get the data, it first has to tell the server that has the data, this API server, that it want to fetch that data. And autofetch basically says that the API will automatically be called whenever this page loads right away. So you don't actually have to go and say call an API. You just create this API in your Toddle app and it'll automatically be fetched when it needs to fetch that data. We're using the default here, so the toddle sort of comes with its own little weather API, which is again calling open weather map for actual data. And it's kind of just the default one when you create a new API as a way of sort of getting some data to work with, right? There's a ton of different things you can do here in the API panel. I'm not going to cover any of it in this video, because we'll go way more into depth of that in later videos. But you can basically set up all the different specification for how this call to that API should be done. The important thing here is the get, which means we want to make that kind of request, that kind of call. There are a few types you can do. Each of them means something different for to the server that we actually make the request to. Get generally just means get me some data. And then the URL we're making the request to. Those are kind of the two most important things, right? And on the right side here, we'll see that we've got the preview of this data. First, we got to see the full URL we're making the request to, but also we got a response back. And this response for APIs and toddle generally have three properties. They've got the data, if there's data coming back from the response, an error in case the server returns some sort of error. Then you can sort of see it here and go and see maybe there was a message, maybe there's a Y with an error. We can kind of fake this. We can go and shake. If we change this, we'll actually to a non-working URL. And you can see sort of as you change this, toddle will actually try and parse it and say, actually, this was the base URL and this is part of the what we call the path, everything after the slash. And since I kind of just broke the URL here by changing the letters, you can see now we get an error from that server back saying 404. I don't know what the wheat thing is supposed to be, right? So we add that back in, and now we should get the data back, right? And the final one is loading. And this is quite useful because when we make it, it's quite fast in this case, but when we make the request, there'll be a short period of time from we made the request, we ask the server for data until it comes back. And in that period, we're essentially waiting for the data. And maybe we would want to show a spinner or some sort of placeholder in our application showcasing that. So you can kind of use this information here as a way of saying, okay, we are currently waiting for data from a server, right? In this case, however, we're not waiting because it's really fast. So we're just we already got the data here for requests we can see, and we can sort of dive into what that looks like. Now, everything inside this data is information coming back from that server. So this isn't really toddle deciding anything what this looks like. It's going to be different for every API. If you're fetching Pokemon data, it's going to look different than weather data. If you're fetching information from Airtable or Supabase or wherever it comes from, each of them is going to be a little bit different. And you generally have to work towards the API. And by that, I mean that the server or the API that sort of says, well, let's say we're using Airtable, you'll call Airtable and say, I want to get all the entries from this specific table. Airtable decides how that data looks. And what I mean by look here is you can see we've got like a location property, and inside that we've got some different properties here, right? With information like what those names are. Is it location, current, hourly, all this? That's all decided by the server. And we don't really have any say in that, at least most of the time. So our application kind of have to just deal with that and then use the data in the format it's delivered. And then toddle lets you actually have some very powerful tools for extracting exactly what you want and making sure you can still display exactly the UI you want. So inside this data, we've got some location information. It can often be really good when you're working with a new API. Just set it up and then start looking into what the data is. And so toddle kind of passes all the data and it displays it nice and visually so you can see what's available. And we can see we've got some location information. And underneath that, we've got latitude and longitude. And we see that comes back as some strings, which is some decimal numbers. We've got a country, looks like a country code DK, because I'm in Denmark at the moment. City of Virum, which is not actually where I am, but this API is based on IP address lookup, so it's not that accurate. And for weather purposes, that's fine. Like, we're not going to be granular down to like the exact square kilometer you're on, right? You just need to be in the right region. And I am indeed in the capital region of Denmark, right? It also gives me some time zone and the current time zone offset. That's actually quite nice. So I know what is the, like, if you get the current time in like Greenwich Mean Time, you know what is the offset for where they are, for where I am right now. We're not going to use that today at all, but it might be something you want to add. You might want to add features to your application later, and then it's quite nice to be able to work, to have this extra data that actually gives you some more functionality you can build into the application. The next sort of property we see here is current, and the current here we can sort of deduce, and I've used this API of course before. This is the current weather. So what is the weather right now? DT, I believe, is date time. Is my best guess at least. I'm not actually 100% sure. This comes from Open Weather. We could go and look at their API. They have documentation for all this, and you can go read about that. But I'm not going to use it right now. Sunrise and sunset. You can see this comes as numbers, which is quite common with a lot of systems. Instead of sending something like format like a date, they actually just send the number, and this number is what's called an epoch time. So it's the number of seconds since the 1st of January 1970, which is just kind of a convention that pretty much every computer system agreed upon. And we can use that in toddle to showcase. We can convert that into a timestamp. We can convert that into both and again, given that we have the time zone offset, we can also say, well, how many hours until this? We can also say, what is it in your local time, etc. So there's a lot of things we can do with the information we get here. Now, the things we care about today for this application, we're going to keep it quite simple. So I want to know what is the city you're in. Maybe country is also nice to display. So we get that from our location part here. And then I want to know what the current temperature is, which is 1.01 degrees. We got a lot of other things we can show here. There's a lot of information coming with. And right now we're probably not going to use most of it for this application at this point. Under current, there's also one more thing that's interesting, is that under weather, there's another property here, and then icons, we get these weather icons, or at least URLs for these weather icons. And this is really nice because then we can show like an image, which is this PNG image of this weather icon, and then we can go in and show like what is the temperature and what our location, right? So that's what we're going to do live. I'm going to close this dialog. And so now our toddle application has this information, and all we really need to do is then display it inside our page here, right? And so I've got my H1 here on the left, and I think what that actually should show is the city name. I think that makes sense. So the way I do is that I select the text node here inside my H1 element, and I can now go in here and just click, and I can change that to say whatever I want. But I can do the same over here if you prefer working in the text area. But I can also click this little FX button here next to the text. And you can see, because we select the text instead of the element, we get a different sort of inspector panel over here, or right panel, right? So now it's what are the options available for text, and there's not a lot you can do with text because you don't actually style the text directly. You style the element that has the text here. So for the text, what we can really do is we can show or hide it, and we'll again feature that in a future video, or we can set it using a formula. So let us click that. So, and this sort of shows one of the really core features of toddle, which is the formula editors. A formula in toddle is every time you need to define some part of your application, some part of UI that is not static. And by that I mean, when I load this application, this H1 is going to say, well, in this case, Virum, or maybe Valby where I'm actually sitting, depending on how the request lands, right? When you might load it, it'll tell you the city name of where you're located. So it's going to be the actual value is going to be different every time. What is consistent when we define is how we get that value. And that's where formulas come in. They allow you to specify how to get the information and not specifically what the information is, because what the information is will be different as you run the application. And right here we can see our formulator. And I can do a few things here in the formulator. The first thing I'm going to do is click this little expand button to go full screen, because that gives us a little bit more to work with. And just like with the canvas, I can zoom and pan just in the same way. And we've got these nodes. We've got one on the left, currently just saying value, hello, because this is a static value of hello. We typed that in before. And then on the right, we get this output one showing what is the actual result of this formula going to be. What I want to do is, instead of using a static value, I'm going to go click the little button here to change it. I'm going to go and select a different node. So the values is one type of node. There's also an API node here. And I can click on our weather API. And now we can see, okay, inside our weather API, there's some different kinds of data available. If we expand the output, we can actually see that the output here matches largely what's on the like. This is now the data we get out. I'm going to go and select the data inside our weather API. So what I'm doing now is, like, just like you saw inside the weather data, we were browsing it. I'm going in and selecting a specific part of that data coming back from the API that I want to display in this H1. And remember, the city was inside location, and then it's called city here. So now we've taken all this weather data and we drilled in and picked out just that city data, right, inside our weather API. And it's just, you can see these little quotes on either side. This shows us that it's a string, like it's text, and it says Vion, and that's what we were looking for. Now when we close this, we can see our H1 says Vion, right? And this now works every time I load this app, that the content of that heading is going to say, well, what was the information of the data? And it's going to actually show that. And if you like call the API again and update, if that data changes, it'll automatically always change the heading 1 to match what that data is in our API. So in the paragraph here, I think I'm gonna do the temperature. So I'm gonna again I'm selecting the text inside my paragraph, and then I'm using this formula, or the FX button here, to open up the formula editor. And again here, I'm doing weather, data, location. And then in this case, it's not location. So let's go one back, data, current for current weather, and then temp. And that shows 101. And actually, I don't like the 1.01. Like the decimal points are kind of relevant here, right? Because it's temperature. Like, you never say it's 1.5 degrees. It's just 1 degree, right? Or maybe 2 in this case, right? So I'm going to round it off. And I have this one node in my formula editor. I can chain together these formula nodes and then create like a whole, what we call computation pipeline. It's a fancy way of saying we're doing more steps, right? So if I click either of these little plus buttons, I can add another node in between. So I'm going to click here, and I'm going to search for one called round. And I've got 3 hits here. I've got my round to the nearest decimal point, round up to the nearest decimal point, or round down to the nearest decimal point. In this case, I'm perfectly happy with round. And the second input here, you can see I can do one, like the first one here is my input to the round formula. And the second one is just how many decimal places do you want. So I can change that to however many I want. But in this case, I mean, I don't want any, right? So I'll change it to 0. So it rounds it off nicely. And so this way we're actually combining multiple steps in our formula to get that output. And these formulas, and we'll show that in later videos, they can become quite complex. Like there's a lot of, you can really add a lot of complexity to those when you start getting into more advanced computations, right? So this is a lot of flexibility you get in toddle for actually, like, no matter where your data are coming from, no matter how it's formatted, what you get, you can sort of shape it into what you need for your application. And that's a really important part of having that flexibility of building the exact application that you want to build. So now it just says 1. And I absolutely could go into this formula and I can add another node that adds like a degree Celsius afterwards. But I can also actually just create another text node. So in this case, I'm going to hold down Alt while I drag this text node onto the paragraph again. So that duplicates it. And then here, I'm just going to type uppercase C, right? And this is not a formula. This is just the letter C, right? But because I put it after that text node, it's now going to read as 1C. And only the one part, only this part is actually going to change depending on the temperature, right? So that looks pretty good. The last thing I want to do is I want to add a image showing the current weather, like an image, an icon representing the current weather, because we saw in our API in here, right, that we actually have that information down here. We get these icons. So let's use one of those. So I want to add an image to my page. I'm going to select the containing element, the one I want to add the image inside. And then I'll select that and I'll click this little plus button next to here. And this opens up my element catalog. So this showcases all the elements that I can add to my page, right? And it'll also show you a little bit of information about each. In this case, I am looking for media and image, right? By default, I'm seeing this big placeholder image that we put in because Toddle doesn't know what image to show yet. Like we haven't told it, right? And it's also adding it last, and I actually want it up top. So I'm just going to drag it up to the top of that div. An image is one of those, or IMG as it's actually called in HTML, is one of those elements that has functionalities attached to it. And this is browser functionality. This is not a Toddle specific thing at all. This is just how that element works in browsers, right? And the way it works is that it'll show an image based on based on an attribute called source, or specifically src in this case. And you can see we've got one in here with a bunch of information showing our default image. And you'll notice that just like we had with our text, we've got this fx button. That means this attribute, or any attribute really, can also be set with a formula in case that you need to show where can I find the information instead of what exactly is the URL. You don't know what the URL is yet because it comes back from the API, but what you're doing is you're telling Toddle where can I find it. And so we're doing the exact same thing again. We're picking our API, weather, data, it's current, and then if I remember correctly, it should be, where is it? Weather, and then icons. Now we can pick large, medium, small. Okay. Yeah. Let's see. Weather, icons. Should we go with large? Large is, yeah, large works. We'll pick that one. And we can see that it's snowing. That's actually kind of true. It kind of just stopped. But yeah. Yeah, so just like we did with the text, we can use formulas here to for image attributes. And you'll show you'll see as we get through these courses that there's actually a ton of different ways you can use formulas. Almost anything that you can do in Toddle can also be, or any sort of value can also be defined in a formula. So it gives you a lot of freedom and flexibility to basically build very complex and very dynamic applications. So we're at the end now. We've built a little app that showcases that, a little weather app that shows the current weather icon. It shows the city we're in, and also what is the temperature in degrees, right? I can now go and click the preview, and this will load this application in a new tab with all this information. And I can showcase that it actually works. And finally, I can then go and say, I would like to publish this application by clicking this publish button. And then I get to write a little message for myself later. Initial release of the weather app. I click publish branch. And what Toddle is going to do is take all those changes on the branch and put it on the main branch, which we call it, which is the one that's live. So that's the one we will find here, toddle_weather.toddle.site. So if we click this now and go and have a look, we'll see that our weather app is now live on our site and ready for anyone to use, right? You can go and try that out on toddle_weather.toddle.site. Right? So the last thing I want to sort of recommend is that you go back. I really recommend you going through all this step. Watching it on a video is really good. You sort of hopefully got a really good idea of how you can get started with the Toddle editor, how different parts of it works. It's the first of 7 videos, so there's a lot more to learn for sure. But I really recommend going out and trying this for yourself. Go and create a new project. Go and add an API. It doesn't have to be the weather API. If you want to be adventurous, go and try something else. But I think weather API is a really good place to get started. If you followed along the step exactly, you'll have to go and create a new branch. So I'm going to just call one called new feature, like that. And this sort of creates a new branch for me to do some new changes to this app. I'm going to see everything that I already did. It's going to create some new changes to this. I can now go and create new changes to the app and then publish them later on. And I really recommend that you try and follow the steps along as I did, and then try and add a new feature. And it's entirely up to you what it can be. You can have a look here at the weather API. Go and take a look at some of the data available. Maybe you want to show the current time zone that people are in. Maybe that makes sense. Maybe you want to show latitude, longitude. Maybe you feel like having the feels like temperature, pressure, humidity, any of this additional information you can add onto the page and showcase in a nice way. Maybe show sunrise, sunset times. Anything you like, anything you find interesting here, go and try and add that to the page to get a feel for how to work with these applications. And when you're done, please go into our Discord and post your weather app. So we can all see what you've been doing, right? That's it for our first video in the Toddle in 7 days series. This is a really good place to get started. We'll add 6 more videos taking you through increasingly more and more complex use cases for Toddle. We'll include things like how do you create interactive applications using events and workflows. We'll see how you can work with different kinds of APIs and backends where you can update data. We'll cover how to do authentication, all that kind of thing. There'll be a ton of good content. So I hope you'll subscribe and check out our future videos. Thank you very much. Remember to sign up for Toddle if you haven't already. Go join our Discord channel as well. It's a really good place to get a ton of support and help. If you get stuck on something and just need someone to help you figure out how to do a little thing. Obviously, learning how to build web apps can be a really big and very sort of intimidating thing sometimes. So joining a community that can support you is a really, really good way to learn. Thank you very much.